In the last section, we looked at how we could protect species by looking at that from an ecosystem perspective and looking at it from the whole. In this chapter, we're going to look at how do we protect species on an individual basis. And your case study that you read is about birds and looking at the impact that people's activities can have on bird population species. We talked about the difference between like indicator species and keystone species. We said that birds are a really big indicator species, and they're that indicator because they have a very limited range, usually in where they live, but we have birds all over the place. So while this bird may only live in the desert, we have other birds that live in colder climates. So we have birds all across the planet, but they really do respond very quickly to that environmental change. So if you change something about their environment, if you cut down their trees, if you increase air pollution, if you increase water pollution, they're going to be impacted rather quickly, and you're going to see and they're a lot easier to count than some other critters like insects or things that burrow or maybe leave a lot more quickly. So the problem with this is if birds go extinct, then we lose some of the ecosystem services that they provide, like pollination, or they can also carry seeds around either by eating them and then by going to the bathroom and the seed kind of passes through, and their feathers, that kind of a thing. They also help to control insect populations. And when we look at the distribution of our birds and where we have them across the planet, what you can see is that a lot of our bird species live down here in the equatorial region where the temperature is a lot more moderate all year long, but that also happens to be areas that we have a high concern about loss of habitat as well. So there's different levels of extinction. The first level is the local extinction, and so that's like the birds are no longer in a specific area, but the bird still exists otherwhere, or animal, I should say, still exists other places in the world. So, for example, wolves were really close to extinction. They were considered locally extinct in Arizona for a long time, but wolves still existed in other places in the world, so they were locally extinct. You could be ecologically extinct, which means that there's only like 3 or 4 of you left, and so you're not providing any ecological services that you used to provide or fulfilling that niche that you used to provide. And so while there's still critters around, and maybe they're in zoos or something like that, they're considered ecologically extinct. Or you can be globally or biologically extinct, which just means that you're gone completely. So we have organisms that went globally extinct that were specifically because of what people did. So these are some examples. The passenger pigeons in the 1920s and 30s. Passenger pigeons, it's horrible kind of, if you do like a Google search, you'll see where women would take like the whole wing of a bird and it would be like on their hat. They were used for just decorative purposes and for meat, but they were driven to extinction. The same thing with the dodo bird. They have this big ruffly tail feather that was highly prized for women in their hats. This guy over here who looks kind of like an ostrich, there was a similar organism to them called the moa that was in New Zealand. They're like giant dumb turkeys. They evolved without contact really from humans, and so they weren't afraid of humans at all. And so when Europeans came into those areas, they could literally walk up and just like whack them on the head and kill them. And that's a lot of meat. That's a really big bird. The moas were 9 feet tall. So we're talking about a whole lot of meat and a whole lot of feathers. The moa, in particular in New Zealand, only the kings were allowed to use the feathers, but everyone was allowed to use the meat. And then when the Europeans came, they weren't as concerned about that, and so they once again took the feathers back for decoration and things. And then we have our endangered and our threatened species. So we have our ones that are extinct, that it's too late now, and then we have our endangered ones that are basically, they're ecologically extinct. And so they we're trying to bring them back from that brink. And then we have threatened species, which aren't quite to that point yet, but they could if we don't do something to protect them or their habitat moving forward. So some examples of our threatened and endangered species around the world, not just here in the United States, but around the world. So there's some characteristics of our organisms that make them more likely to become extinct, and some of them have to do with whether or not they're a K or an R selective strategist. So our K selective strategists, remember, are like our kangaroos or people, and they have low reproductive rates, and so when you start to kill them off, it's really hard for them to recover because they don't have very many babies. If they have a very specialized niche, there's only certain places where they can feed or where they can survive, and then those become threatened. That becomes very difficult, and that kind of goes along with the narrow distribution as well. So if they have to live in a very specialized area, or like sorrel-cacti only live here in Arizona. We've got lots of them, they're not on the endangered species list, but if something were to happen to the climate of Arizona and were to shift, then they could be. So if they feed it at the higher trophic level, they're a lot more susceptible to chemicals and to pollutants and things like that, because they concentrate or they bioaccumulate as they go up the food chain, and so that makes them more susceptible. The fixed migratory patterns goes along with the narrow distribution and the specialized niche. They have only a certain way that they go, and if something happens along their migratory path, then they have a lot of trouble. If they're rare, then people like them and they want them, and so that's becomes it's kind of like you're endangered, so you become more rare, so more people want to have the evidence that they have pelts or skins or whatever that go along with that. They're commercially valuable, so they can sell them for something, so either sell the organism itself or parts of it, like the rhinoceros horn, things like that. Or if they have a really large territory that's being encroached upon, which kind of leads us into habitat fragmentation that we'll talk about in just a minute. So there's the Endangered Species Act that we'll talk about here in the United States, but there's also a red list that is for a worldwide, and that lists the world's threatened and endangered species. There's no real protections in place. You're not supposed to trade things that are on the red list, but they really rely on the countries of origin of people in order to enforce those rules and regulations. Just looking at our breakdown of organisms that are in danger due to human activities. As we talk about extinctions happened, and they've gone. We've looked at the geologic timescale. We know that there are species that have their heyday, they flourish, and then they go extinct. The concern right now is that the extinction rate is really, really high compared to prior to people being really an impact on ecosystems. And so we're looking at losing species at a rate that exceeds the Permian extinction or the Cretaceous extinction that the Mesozoic, the one that started the Cretaceous, that killed off all the dinosaurs. We're looking at rates that exceed those. And so it's a bit of a concern because, once again, we don't know what the benefit and all the ecological services that all those organisms provide us. So this could lead to another mass extinction, and so as we look at protecting species, we look in these hotspots. We look in areas where those species are concentrated and try to protect those environments. And sometimes we do that through laws that are based off of this particular species, and we use that species to protect the habitat. We talked about this a little bit already, about the ecological and economic services. So one of the problems, and this is an acronym that you're going to want to remember, is when we look at what causes a premature extinction of species, is the HIPPO acronym. We're going to talk about each one of these in detail. So when we look at habitat loss and degradation, these things kind of all in the overharvest, all parts of HIPPO are in this chart, and we have our basic causes. And if you look at it again, once again, we're back to increased population and poverty, because if you have those two things, then the focus is not on environmental issues, the focus is on your population surviving. And so all the other things happen as a result of that. Primary goal is to survive, and so just like any other species, our species wants to be able to survive. And if we have these basic underlying reasons for that are threatening our survival, then that's something that's going to influence our decision-making process. So habitat loss is a huge issue with our endangered species. When we have organisms that have larger ranges, you can see in these little diagrams, the grayed out area is the area that they used to have as far as a range, and now the red area is where they have now. And so when you have organisms, especially when you're looking at these big land organisms that needed that big range and they just don't have it anymore, that becomes very difficult then for the survival of the species. We have invasive species that come in and will take over environments. So this one here was an invasive species that was purposefully introduced to help with erosion. And this is covering a house now, the kudzu vine. And we went back east a few years ago, and it's everywhere. Like, it hangs off of the power lines, and I mean, it's like it's everywhere, and nothing eats it. And so it can take over really easily. So some things that may have been introduced unintentionally and some intentionally. We bring in bees and things like that. Sometimes people brought in, they brought over flowers or things like that they liked from where they came from, but there's nothing here that eats it. They may have brought in organisms because they wanted to hunt them, like the European wild boar, and then they kind of took over in areas. And then some that hitchhiked along. Most of these were hitchhikers, so they came in boats, they came in shipping containers, they came with livestock or things like that as they came over. The zebra mussel came attached on the bottoms of ships. Lampreys came with fish that we brought over. This brown tree snake actually came in on planes, if you can imagine. They would actually get up, like, on planes, they would like go up around the wheels and get up into the recesses where the wheels are at, and then when the plane would land, they would fall out of there and come into the different countries. So craziness, and some of them came over with plant species and things like that. We also have invasive species, once again, that are very harmful, and one of the problems is that there's no natural predators. So like these fire ants that are now in the United States, nothing eats them. They have a very painful sting. They outcompete other ant species, and they're here accidentally. So when we look at what to do about invasive species, really prevention is the best way, and that's making sure that you don't bring in wild critters that you're not supposed to have, and you don't let them out into other areas. That you're not bringing, like, if you have a fish tank, you don't dump your fish tank out into water, into a pond or something like that. You don't take your fish that were in your fish tank, or turtles or things like that, and then go put them out into the aquatic environment, that sort of stuff. Don't put bait in the water. Clean off the bottoms of boats, things like that, trying to prevent that movement of species.